Bullies threw her bra in the hallway. She broke one's arm after class. Bullies threw her bra in the hallway. She broke one's arm after class. Jordan Hayes had learned to make herself invisible long before she arrived at Ridgemont Valley High. It was a skill she'd perfected over the years, moving from base to base with her father, always the new kid, always the outsider looking for a corner where she could disappear. Her father, Daniel Hayes, had retired from active duty 6 months ago, and they'd finally settled in the small California town of Ridgemont, nestled between rolling hills and sprawling suburbs, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Jordan was slight, with mousy brown hair that hung past her shoulders, glasses that slipped down her nose, and clothes that came from discount stores rather than the boutiques where the popular students shopped. She walked with her shoulders curved inward, her backpack heavy with textbooks, her eyes fixed on the linoleum floors that stretched through Ridgemont Valley High's corridors like rivers of beige indifference. The school itself was a sprawling complex of buildings connected by covered walkways, built in the 70s and updated just enough to seem modern without losing its institutional soul. The main quad sat at the heart of everything, a square of concrete surrounded by benches where the social hierarchy revealed itself with brutal clarity every lunch period. The popular students claimed the center tables, their laughter carrying across the space like territorial markers. Athletes gathered near the gym entrance, still wearing their practice jerseys and letter jackets even in the California heat. The art students congregated near the mural-covered wall by the music building, and everyone else found whatever spaces remained, like water filling the cracks between rocks. Jordan usually ate in the library, a 2-story building at the edge of campus, where Mrs. Chen, the librarian, never questioned why a student would choose books over socialization. The bullying started small, the way these things always do. Jordan's first week at Ridgemont Valley High, she'd accidentally bumped into Vanessa Kingsley in the hallway near the lockers. Vanessa was everything Jordan wasn't. Tall, blonde, perfectly proportioned, with the kind of effortless confidence that came from a lifetime of being chosen first, admired most, and never questioned. She wore designer clothes that fit like they'd been made specifically for her body, and she moved through the halls with an entourage that parted for her like the Red Sea. Vanessa had turned at the contact, her blue eyes narrowing, and said nothing. Just looked Jordan up and down with an expression that managed to convey both amusement and contempt. Then continued walking as if Jordan were no more significant than a fly that had briefly landed on her shoulder. After that, things escalated with a precision that suggested Vanessa had done this before. Jordan's locker, located in the south hallway near the science wing, started being knocked into when she was trying to open it, causing her to drop her books. Notes appeared in her backpack, not threatening, just mocking observations about her clothes, her hair, her posture. In the cafeteria, if Jordan tried to sit anywhere near the popular tables, conversations would halt and stares would follow until she moved elsewhere. The gym became a particular nightmare during the mandatory physical education classes that met 3 times a week. Jordan had changed in the corner of the locker room, moving quickly, but she'd felt eyes on her, heard the whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter from Vanessa's group. They never said anything directly, never crossed any line that would make their behavior reportable to Coach Martinez, who supervised the locker room with the enthusiasm of someone counting down to retirement. Vanessa's inner circle consisted of 4 others, each with their own role in the ecosystem of cruelty. Tiffany Chen was Vanessa's right hand, a girl with glossy black hair and a talent for social manipulation that bordered on artistic. She could spread a rumor through the school faster than wildfire, and she had connections in every social group, which made her dangerous in ways Vanessa's direct approach wasn't. Madison Porter was the muscle of the group, not literally, but in terms of presence. She was big, athletic, played varsity volleyball, and had a voice that carried. When Madison laughed at someone, Everyone heard it. Then there were Blake Sutton and Ryan Fisher, two boys who orbited Vanessa like moons around a planet. Blake was handsome in a manufactured way, all styled hair and carefully curated stubble, captain of the soccer team and very aware of his status. Ryan was quieter, more calculating, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a subtle cruelty that manifested in perfectly timed comments that cut deeper than outright insults. Jordan endured it all without complaint. She'd promised her father that this move would be different, that she'd try to fit in, that she wouldn't cause problems. Daniel Hayes had sacrificed his career to give her stability, taking a job with a private security firm that kept him in town instead of deployed overseas. And Jordan felt the weight of that sacrifice every day. He'd come home to their small rental house on Maple Street, tired from training corporate security teams, and ask about her day with genuine interest, and Jordan would lie with practiced ease. School was fine, classes were good, she was making friends. The lies came easily because she'd been telling versions of them her whole life, and because the alternative, admitting she was failing at the one thing he'd asked of her, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd given up. Their house was modest, a two-bedroom bungalow with a small yard and a garage that Daniel had converted into a home gym. Jordan would come home most days and find him there, working through routines that kept him in the same shape he'd maintained in the military. He taught Jordan to fight when she was younger, not because he wanted her to be violent, but because he wanted her to be safe. Krav Maga had been his specialty in special operations, and he'd passed those skills to Jordan the way other fathers taught their daughters to ride bikes or throw baseballs. But along with the physical training had come a philosophy that Jordan had absorbed completely. Violence was the last resort, a tool used only when all other options were exhausted, and even then it should be controlled, measured, and never used in anger. Jordan had internalized this so deeply that the idea of using her skills against the students at Ridgemont Valley High felt impossible, like speaking a foreign language she'd forgotten. The weeks blurred together in a rhythm of humiliation and endurance. October arrived with its promise of cooling weather that never quite materialized in Southern California. The parking lot behind the gym, where students parked if they had cars or waited for rides if they didn't, became another venue for Vanessa's attention. Jordan took the bus, one of only a handful of students who did, and the bus stop was visible from the parking lot, which meant Vanessa and her friends could watch and comment as Jordan waited each afternoon. They never approached directly, never said anything she could report, but their laughter carried, and Jordan knew she was the subject even without hearing the specific words. She'd stand there with her backpack, watching the golden California sun sink toward the hills, and practice the breathing techniques her father had taught her, counting inhales and exhales until the bus arrived and she could escape. In class, Jordan was invisible by design. She sat in the back, took meticulous notes, and never volunteered answers even when she knew them. Her teachers barely registered her presence. Mr. Jacobson, who taught American history in room 204, called on her exactly once in the first month, seemed surprised when she answered correctly, and then never called on her again. Mrs. Patterson, who taught advanced English in the portable classroom near the parking lot, had a tendency to call on the same 5 students for every discussion, and Jordan wasn't among them. Only Ms. Reeves, who taught physics in the science wing, seemed to notice Jordan at all, and even that attention was limited to approving nods when Jordan turned in assignments that demonstrated understanding beyond what the curriculum required. Physics made sense to Jordan in a way social dynamics never would. Forces and reactions, momentum and energy, all governed by laws that were consistent and predictable, if only human behavior followed such reliable patterns. The locker room incident happened on a Tuesday in late October. Jordan had developed a routine for gym class that minimized her exposure. Arrive early, change quickly in the corner stall, keep her clothes in her gym bag rather than using the lockers that lined the walls. But that Tuesday, she'd been delayed in her previous class, arriving at the locker room with only minutes before Coach Martinez would blow her whistle and expect everyone in the gym. The locker room was crowded, full of bodies and conversation, and Jordan had moved to her usual corner only to find it occupied. She'd hesitated, uncertain, and in that moment of indecision, Tiffany had bumped into her, causing Jordan's bag to fall and spill its contents across the floor. Clothes scattered, books slid under benches, and her bra, a simple, practical thing bought from a 3-pack at Target, landed at Vanessa's feet. Vanessa had picked it up with 2 fingers, holding it away from her body like it was contaminated, and the room had gone quiet. Jordan had frozen, her face burning, her hands trembling as she'd crouched to gather her scattered belongings. Vanessa had said something. Jordan couldn't remember what exactly, her memory of the moment blurred by humiliation, and then tossed the bra back toward Jordan. But it had fallen short, landing in the middle of the aisle between lockers, and Jordan had to crawl forward to retrieve it while dozens of eyes watched. The laughter had been almost gentle, more pitying than cruel, which somehow made it worse. Jordan had grabbed her things, shoved them back in her bag and left without changing, taking the absence mark from Coach Martinez rather than staying in that room another second. But the incident hadn't ended there. By lunch, Jordan discovered that someone had taken a photo, she never knew who, and by the end of the day, half the school had seen it. Not the actual image, because even teenagers understood the line that couldn't be crossed, but descriptions of it, embellished and exaggerated, had spread like a virus through social media channels Jordan didn't even use. Students she'd never spoken to seemed to know about it, and the looks she received as she walked to her bus were different than before, more openly mocking, less concerned with subtlety. Jordan had sat on the bus, staring out the window at the suburban landscape passing by. Strip malls and tract housing and palm trees standing like sentinels against the sky, and felt something crack inside her. Not break, but crack, like glass under pressure, forming patterns that would determine how it eventually shattered. That evening, Daniel had noticed immediately that something was wrong. Jordan had always been good at hiding her emotions, but her father had been trained to read people, and he'd seen through her facade within minutes of her arrival home. They'd sat at the kitchen table, a small round thing from IKEA that served as their dining room, and Jordan had told him everything, not just about that day, but about all of it. The constant pressure, the isolation, the feeling of being a target for reasons she couldn't control or change. Daniel had listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral in that way he had when he was processing information and deciding on a course of action. When Jordan finished, he'd been quiet for a long moment, then asked her what she wanted to do about it. Jordan hadn't known how to answer. Part of her wanted him to fix it, to march into the school and make it stop the way he'd fixed problems when she was younger. But she was older now, and she understood that some problems couldn't be solved by parental intervention, that sometimes such interference only made things worse. She'd told him she could handle it, that it wasn't that bad, that she just needed to vent. Daniel had studied her with those sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing, then nodded slowly. He told her that if she ever changed her mind, if she ever needed him to step in, she only had to ask. But he'd also reminded her that she had tools most people didn't, skills that could change the entire dynamic if she chose to use them. Jordan had promised she wouldn't let it get that far, that she'd find another way, and Daniel had accepted her answer even though they both knew it might be a lie. November arrived with actual rain, a rarity in Southern California that turned the campus into a landscape of puddles and muddy grass. The quad became less appealing for lunch, driving more students into the cafeteria, which meant Jordan lost even her refuge in the library, since Mrs. Chen had started enforcing the no-food rule more strictly. The cafeteria was a large space with floor-to-ceiling windows along one wall looking out onto the main quad, and rows of tables that seemed to amplify every sound until the noise became almost physical. Jordan bought lunch. The school offered surprisingly decent food, one of the few positive things she could say about Ridgemont Valley High, and tried to find corners where she could eat without being noticed. But the cafeteria had no real corners, just angles where tables met walls. And even those spaces were claimed territory. She'd been eating in the area near the kitchen, where students bust their trays, when Madison had bumped her table hard enough to knock over Jordan's water bottle. The liquid had spread across the table and dripped onto Jordan's jeans, and Jordan had jumped up, grabbing napkins, trying to prevent it from soaking her completely. Madison had apologized in a voice loud enough to draw attention, saying she was so sorry she hadn't seen Jordan there. She should really pay more attention to where she was going. The apology was structured perfectly to sound sincere while emphasizing Jordan's invisibility, and the students nearby had laughed because they understood the subtext, even if they wouldn't have been able to articulate it. Jordan had cleaned up the mess, thrown away her lunch, and spent the rest of the period in the bathroom, using the hand dryer to dry her jeans while standing in a stall so no one would see her. The attacks were never quite enough to report. That was the genius of Vanessa's approach. She understood instinctively where the lines were drawn and how to operate just on the safe side of them. Accidental collisions, overheard comments that could be denied or explained away, laughter that could be attributed to private jokes having nothing to do with Jordan, social media posts that never mentioned Jordan by name, but described situations specific enough that everyone knew the target. When Jordan had finally gone to Ms. Henderson, the vice principal whose office was located near the main entrance of the administration building, she'd been met with sympathy, but no action. Ms. Henderson had listened, taken notes, and explained that without specific incidents she could verify, without witnesses willing to come forward, without evidence of direct harassment, there wasn't much the school could do. She'd suggested Jordan try to make friends, join clubs, get involved in activities that would help her integrate into the school community. The advice was well-intentioned and completely useless, and Jordan had left the office feeling more alone than before. But something had shifted after that conversation with her father. Jordan found herself noticing things she'd ignored before, the way Vanessa's confidence sometimes seemed forced, especially around Blake, as if she was performing for his benefit rather than acting from genuine feeling. The way Tiffany watched everyone with an intensity that suggested deep insecurity beneath her social grace. The way Madison's aggression seemed to intensify after phone calls she took in the hallway, her voice lowered, but her body language tense. Even Blake and Ryan, who seemed to glide through their days on rails of privilege and athletic prowess, had moments when their masks slipped and Jordan could see the pressure they were under. Blake from his father, who attended every soccer game and criticized every perceived mistake, and Ryan from expectations Jordan didn't fully understand, but could sense in the way he carried himself, like a performer who'd forgotten he had an audience but continued the show anyway. Understanding them didn't make their behavior acceptable, but it made them human, and that realization complicated Jordan's feelings in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd wanted to hate them cleanly, completely, but hate required a kind of energy Jordan didn't have, and seeing their weaknesses made them seem less like monsters and more like people making choices Jordan would never make. It didn't excuse anything, but it changed the texture of her anger, made it colder and more analytical. Jordan started watching them the way a scientist might observe subjects in an experiment, noting patterns, predicting behaviors, understanding the ecosystem of cruelty they'd created. The art studio became Jordan's sanctuary during this period. It was located in a separate building near the back of campus, a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a space for visual arts. Jordan had taken art fundamentals as an elective, mostly because it fit her schedule and required minimal social interaction, and she'd discovered an unexpected aptitude for it. The instructor, Mr. Giordano, was a man in his 60s with paint-stained clothes and a philosophy that art was personal expression rather than technical perfection. He never forced students to share their work, never made anyone explain their choices, and the studio had a peaceful quality that Jordan found nowhere else at Ridgemont Valley High. She'd stay after class sometimes, working on projects that went beyond the assignments, losing herself in the process of translating emotion into visual form. It was in the art studio that Jordan first spoke to Marcus Chen, though she'd change his name later in her memory because the universe had a sense of irony. No, his name was actually David Chen, and he was Tiffany's older brother, though the two seemed to exist in completely different social universes. David was quiet, intense, with black-framed glasses and hands that moved with precision, whether he was drawing or building the intricate sculptures he specialized in. He was there every day after school, working on a piece for his portfolio, and he'd noticed Jordan's presence the way people who spend a lot of time alone notice each other. They'd started with nods, then brief comments about materials or techniques, and eventually actual conversations that Jordan found surprisingly easy. David knew about his sister's behavior. It was impossible not to in a school the size of Ridgemont Valley High, where gossip traveled faster than sound. He'd approached Jordan one afternoon in mid-November, when the rain was hammering on the studio's metal roof, and apologized. Not for Tiffany specifically, but for not having said anything sooner, for not having intervened, even though he knew intervention might not help. Jordan had appreciated the gesture, even as she understood its limitations. David couldn't control his sister any more than Jordan could control Vanessa, but his acknowledgement of the situation meant something. They'd become friends after that, or something close to friendship, two people who understood what it meant to not quite fit in the spaces they occupied. Through David, Jordan learned more about the social dynamics of Ridgemont Valley High than she'd been able to piece together on her own. Vanessa's family was wealthy, her father a lawyer who handled high-profile cases in Los Angeles and had political ambitions that kept him in the news. Vanessa felt enormous pressure to maintain a certain image, to be perfect in every visible way, and that pressure had calcified into the need to control her environment completely. Blake's family was similar. Old money, country club memberships, expectations that he'd attend an Ivy League school and eventually take over his father's investment firm. Tiffany, David explained, had always felt like she was in her brother's shadow academically, and she'd compensated by becoming socially dominant in ways David never could or wanted to be. Madison came from a military family like Jordan, but unlike Jordan, she'd responded to constant relocation by becoming aggressive rather than invisible. And Ryan was the son of Ridgemont's mayor, which came with its own set of complications Jordan was only beginning to understand. Knowing their backgrounds didn't excuse their behavior, but it provided context that helped Jordan understand the machinery of cruelty she'd been caught in. They weren't evil, just trapped in their own ways, acting out scripts they'd internalized without examining. That understanding didn't make Jordan's situation better, but it changed how she thought about eventual resolution. Violence would solve nothing permanent. It might win a battle, but would lose the war, creating more problems than it solved. What Jordan needed was transformation, a change so fundamental that the entire dynamic would shift. She just didn't know yet how to achieve that. The breaking point came in early December, during the weeks leading up to winter break, when the school seemed to vibrate with anticipation of freedom. There was a dance scheduled, the winter formal, and the campus was covered with posters advertising it in silver and blue. Jordan had no intention of attending. Dances were social minefields even for popular students. And for someone like her, they were simply opportunities for public humiliation. But the dance created a particular energy in the school, a heightened awareness of social status and coupling that made existing hierarchies more visible and more rigid. Jordan had been in the hallway near her locker, switching books between classes, when she'd overheard Blake talking to Ryan about the dance. They were standing close enough that she could hear every word, discussing who they were taking, what their plans were afterward, and, casually, as if it was the most natural topic in the world, making a bet about whether Vanessa would finally hook up with Blake that night. The conversation was crude and disrespectful, and Jordan had felt anger flare in her chest, not because she cared about Vanessa's reputation, but because it revealed the contempt these boys had for everyone, even their supposed friends. She'd closed her locker more loudly than intended, and both boys had turned to look at her. Ryan had smiled, that calculated smile that never reached his eyes, and asked Jordan if she was planning to go to the dance. The question was clearly rhetorical, designed to emphasize her exclusion, and Jordan had shaken her head and started to walk away. But Blake had stepped into her path, not threateningly, just enough to make passing awkward, and asked if she'd consider going with him. The offer was obviously a joke, delivered with a smirk that made it clear he expected her to refuse, or perhaps flee in embarrassment. Jordan had looked at him, really looked, and seen the insecurity beneath the performance, the need for validation that drove even this casual cruelty. She'd told him no thank you, that she had other plans, and pushed past him with enough force to make her point without escalating the situation. But the encounter had rattled something loose in Jordan's carefully maintained composure. That evening, she'd gone into the garage where Daniel was working through his routine and asked him to train her. Not the casual instruction he'd provided over the years, but real training, the kind he'd done with special operations soldiers. Daniel had stopped mid-movement, studying her with that assessing gaze, and asked if she was sure. Jordan had nodded, and they'd begun that night, working in the garage after dinner. Daniel teaching her not just techniques, but philosophy, not just how to fight, but when and why. The training was different than what Jordan remembered from her childhood. Daniel focused on control rather than power, on reading opponents and responding to their energy rather than imposing her own. Krav Maga was designed for efficiency, for ending threats quickly and decisively, but Daniel adapted it for Jordan's specific situation. He taught her locks and holds that would immobilize without injuring, strikes that would create space without causing lasting damage, defensive techniques that would make her impossible to corner or overwhelm. They worked on awareness, on reading body language and anticipating attacks, on staying calm under pressure. Most importantly, Daniel taught her that fighting was conversation, a back-and-forth exchange where the goal wasn't to destroy the other person, but to communicate that she was not a victim, that she had boundaries that would be enforced. Jordan trained every evening, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2, until her muscles ached and her mind was clear. She'd shower, do her homework, and sleep deeply for the first time since starting at Ridgemont Valley High. The training gave her something she'd been missing, not just physical capability, but a sense of control over her own narrative. She wasn't just enduring anymore, she was preparing, building towards something she couldn't yet articulate, but could feel taking shape, like a sculpture emerging from stone. During the day, she continued her routine at school, unchanged on the surface but different beneath, and she waited for the moment when all this preparation would matter. That moment came in January, after winter break had provided a temporary reprieve from the daily grind of school social dynamics. The break had been good for Jordan. 2 weeks of peace, of training with her father, of reading and drawing and existing without the constant pressure of Vanessa's attention. But returning to Ridgemont Valley High felt like stepping back into a familiar nightmare, and Jordan had walked through the front entrance on that first day of the spring semester with a sense of dread that no amount of training could completely eliminate. The semester had started with new seating arrangements in most classes, which meant Jordan was now sitting in the middle of Mrs. Patterson's advanced English class rather than safely in the back. The new seat put her directly in front of Ryan, who'd taken the opportunity to make Jordan's life miserable in small, calculated ways that Mrs. Patterson never noticed. He tapped Jordan's chair with his foot, just enough to be annoying but not enough to be obvious. He'd make comments under his breath during discussions, disagreeing with whatever Jordan said, even when she didn't say anything, creating a phantom conversation that made her look argumentative. He'd ask to borrow a pen or paper, always at inconvenient moments, always with that same calculated smile that suggested he was doing her a favor by acknowledging her existence. But Jordan had changed during the break. She didn't react to Ryan's provocations, didn't give him the visible discomfort he was seeking. She'd learned from her training that reaction was power, that showing emotion was giving information, and she maintained a careful neutrality that seemed to frustrate Ryan more than any response would have. After a week of this, Ryan had escalated, accidentally knocking Jordan's backpack off her desk during class so that her books and papers spilled across the floor. Jordan had picked everything up without comment, without even looking at Ryan, and continued taking notes as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Patterson had glanced over, concerned, but Jordan had shaken her head slightly, indicating it wasn't worth addressing, and the class had continued. It was in the gym, during the mandatory physical education class that Jordan had learned to dread, that Vanessa made her move. The class was playing volleyball, a sport Jordan had no particular skill in, but could perform adequately enough not to draw attention. The teams had been divided randomly, and Jordan found herself on the opposite team from Vanessa, which meant she was safe for the moment from direct interaction. But during a rotation, when Jordan was in the back row, Vanessa had served the ball directly at Jordan's face with enough force that only reflexes kept it from connecting. The ball had sailed past Jordan, who'd flinched but not moved quickly enough to return it, and Vanessa had called out an apology that fooled no one who'd seen the trajectory of that serve. Coach Martinez, who was scrolling through her phone on the sidelines, had looked up long enough to tell everyone to focus, and the game had continued. But the message was clear. Vanessa was done with subtle harassment and moving towards something more direct. Jordan had finished the class on high alert, watching Vanessa the way prey watches predators, and she'd changed in the locker room with more speed than usual, wanting to be out of that enclosed space where anything could happen without witnesses who cared. The library became Jordan's refuge again during this period, and it was there that she met Sarah Wright, though Jordan would always think of her by a different name, something more fitting for the person Sarah actually was, rather than the generic identifier her parents had chosen. Let's say her name was actually Emma Wright, a student who transferred to Ridgemont Valley High in January and was navigating her own adjustment to the school's social landscape. Emma was tall, athletic, with dark hair pulled back in a perpetual ponytail and a directness that Jordan found refreshing after months of navigating subtle social cues. Emma played basketball, had moved from Nevada, and had no patience for the kind of political maneuvering that dominated Ridgemont Valley High's social scene. They'd met when Emma had asked to share Jordan's table in the library, claiming all the other spots were taken, even though several were clearly empty. Jordan had recognized the gesture for what it was, an offer of alliance from someone who'd identified another outsider, and accepted it with relief. They'd started eating lunch together, talking between bites about their classes, their frustrations, their observations about the strange social ecosystem of their school. Emma was perceptive, and she'd noticed things about Vanessa's group that Jordan had missed, patterns in their behavior that suggested vulnerabilities Jordan might be able to exploit if she chose to. But Jordan wasn't interested in playing those games, in becoming the kind of person who manipulated others for advantage. She just wanted to exist without being a target. Through Emma, Jordan learned about the basketball team's dynamics, about the coach who actually cared about her players, about the athletic culture that existed parallel to, but separate from, the popularity hierarchy Vanessa dominated. Emma had invited Jordan to watch a game, and Jordan had gone, sitting in the bleachers of the gym, and watching Emma play with a focus and intensity Jordan recognized from her own training. After the game, Emma had introduced Jordan to some of her teammates, and Jordan had experienced something novel at Ridgemont Valley High: acceptance without judgment, inclusion without cost. The basketball players were too busy with their own priorities to care about the social dramas that consumed others, and they treated Jordan with a casual friendliness that felt like water after a long drought. But this new friendship made Jordan more visible, which made her more vulnerable. Vanessa noticed Emma's attention to Jordan, and something shifted in her approach. The harassment became more pointed, more personal, more designed to isolate Jordan from her new friend. Tiffany started sitting near Emma in the classes they shared, offering friendship and inclusion in Vanessa's group, clearly trying to draw Emma away from Jordan. Madison made comments about the basketball team, loud enough for Emma to hear, questioning their abilities and dedication in ways that were clearly designed to provoke a response. Blake started paying attention to Emma in the parking lot, offering rides, making conversation, using his charm in ways that made his intentions obvious to everyone, including Emma, who'd rebuffed him with a bluntness that had made Blake's friends laugh at his expense. The situation escalated through January and into February, the tension building like pressure in a sealed container. Jordan continued training with her father, the sessions growing more intense as Daniel recognized that something was approaching a breaking point. He taught Jordan not just how to fight, but how to end fights, how to de-escalate when possible and control when necessary, how to read a situation and respond appropriately. They practiced scenarios, Daniel playing the role of aggressor while Jordan defended, and he was ruthless in his critiques, pushing Jordan to move faster, think clearer, stay calmer. The training was exhausting and exhilarating, and Jordan felt herself changing in ways that went beyond physical capability. She was shedding the persona she'd worn for so long, the invisible girl who absorbed punishment without response, and becoming someone new, someone who had boundaries and would enforce them. The Valentine's Day dance was announced in early February, posters appearing across campus featuring hearts and promises of an unforgettable evening. Jordan ignored them, having no interest in the ritual humiliation such events represented for people outside the social mainstream. But Emma wanted to go, and she'd asked Jordan to come with her, not as dates, but as friends, as a statement that they didn't need romantic partners to participate in school events. Jordan had hesitated, weighing the risk against the opportunity, and finally agreed, partially because Emma had asked, and partially because she was tired of letting fear dictate her choices. The weeks leading up to the dance were tense but uneventful. Jordan continued her routine: classes, training, time in the art studio, lunches with Emma in the cafeteria because Emma refused to hide in the library. The harassment continued, but at a lower intensity, as if Vanessa was saving her energy for something bigger. Jordan felt it too, that sense of approaching confrontation, and she prepared mentally the way her father had taught her, visualizing scenarios and planning responses, staying present rather than catastrophizing about possibilities. The dance itself was held in the gym, which had been transformed with decorations that made it almost unrecognizable. Silver and red streamers hung from the ceiling, tables were set up along the walls with snacks and punch, and a DJ played music loud enough to make conversation difficult. Jordan and Emma had arrived together, dressed appropriately but not elaborately, and they'd stationed themselves near one of the snack tables where they could observe without being central to the action. The gym was crowded with students, couples dancing in the center of the floor, groups of friends clustering together, the usual social hierarchy on full display in the organization of bodies in space. Vanessa had arrived with Blake, both of them dressed like they were attending a Hollywood premiere rather than a high school dance. They'd made an entrance, walking through the gym doors with the confidence of people who knew they owned the room, and they'd been absorbed immediately into the center of attention. Jordan had watched from her position by the wall, observing the performance with the same analytical distance she'd developed over months of observation. Vanessa was performing for Blake, who was performing for his friends, who were performing for everyone else. Layers of artifice so deep, Jordan wondered if anyone at the dance was actually genuine. The evening had proceeded uneventfully until near the end, when the music had slowed and couples had moved closer together on the dance floor. Jordan had been talking with Emma about leaving, both of them tired of the noise and the crowd, when Tiffany had approached. She'd been smiling, friendly, and she'd asked if she could talk to Jordan privately for a moment. Emma had tensed, protective, but Jordan had agreed, curious about what Tiffany wanted. They'd walked to a quieter area near the locker room entrance, away from the music and the crowd, and Tiffany had dropped her smile like a mask she'd been wearing. Tiffany had told Jordan that she needed to stay away from Emma, not as a threat, but as advice, as if she was doing Jordan a favor by warning her. Emma was making connections with people in Vanessa's circle, and Jordan's presence was making that difficult. If Jordan really cared about Emma, Tiffany had said, she'd recognize that her friendship was hurting Emma's chances at having a normal social life at Ridgemont Valley High. The argument was sophisticated and cruel, designed to make Jordan's isolation seem like self-sacrifice, and for a moment, Jordan had felt the old pull toward invisibility, the temptation to disappear and stop causing problems. But then she'd remembered her training, her father's voice telling her that boundaries were about self-respect first and everything else second, and she told Tiffany that her friendship with Emma was none of Tiffany's business. Tiffany's expression had hardened, the friendly mask disappearing completely, and she told Jordan that she was making a mistake, that Vanessa had been patient, but patience had limits. Jordan had asked what exactly Vanessa thought she could do, and Tiffany had smiled again, colder than before, and said Jordan would find out. Then she'd walked away, leaving Jordan standing alone near the locker room entrance, adrenaline flooding her system, her training screaming at her to stay alert because something was coming. Jordan had returned to Emma, who'd immediately asked what happened, and Jordan had told her everything. Emma's response had been immediate and unequivocal. They should leave now, before whatever Vanessa was planning could happen. They'd headed for the exit, navigating through the crowd, and they'd almost made it when Madison had stepped into their path. She'd been with 2 other girls from the volleyball team, blocking the way to the door, and she'd asked Jordan where she was going in a tone that made it clear she already knew the answer. Emma had tried to push past, but Madison had put a hand on her shoulder, not aggressively but firmly, and suggested they stay and enjoy the dance a little longer. What happened next occurred so quickly that Jordan's memory of it was fragmented, a series of images rather than a coherent narrative. Blake had appeared from somewhere, along with Ryan, and suddenly Jordan and Emma were surrounded by Vanessa's entire group. Vanessa herself had joined them, and she'd made a speech about how Jordan needed to learn her place, about how she'd been given opportunities to understand the social order and had refused them all, about how tonight would be educational. The speech was delivered calmly, almost kindly, which made it more threatening than any overt hostility would have been. Jordan had looked around, assessing the situation with the clarity her training had given her. They were near the exit, but not close enough to reach it before being stopped. The gym was crowded, but everyone was focused on the music and dancing, and the area they were in was dim enough that even if someone looked over, they might not understand what was happening. Emma was tense beside her, ready to fight, but smart enough to recognize they were outnumbered. Jordan's options were limited. She could try to talk her way out, which seemed unlikely to work, or she could try to force her way through, which would escalate the situation in ways she'd been trying to avoid for months. She chose a third option, which was to wait and see what Vanessa actually planned to do before responding. The answer came quickly. Vanessa had gestured to Madison, who'd grabbed Emma's arm and started pulling her away from Jordan. Emma had resisted, trying to twist free, but Madison was stronger, and she'd been joined by one of the other volleyball players. They'd separated Emma from Jordan efficiently, and Jordan had started to move toward her friend, only to find Blake and Ryan blocking her path. Ryan had told her that Emma would be fine, that they just wanted to talk to Jordan alone, and Jordan had understood immediately that separating her from Emma was the entire point. With Emma as leverage, Jordan would comply with whatever came next to keep her friends safe. They'd escorted Jordan out of the gym, not roughly but firmly, with Blake on one side and Ryan on the other. Vanessa and Tiffany had followed, and they'd walked across the campus to the art studio, which was unlocked because Mr. Giordano often worked late on weekends. The studio was dark and empty, illuminated only by the security lights that filtered through the high windows. Jordan had been positioned in the center of the room, surrounded by Vanessa's group, and she'd understood that whatever was about to happen was meant to break her completely. But Jordan wasn't the same person she'd been in October when the bullying had started. Months of training had changed her, not just physically, but mentally, and she'd faced this moment so many times in visualization that the reality of it felt almost familiar. She'd centered herself the way Daniel had taught her, breathing deeply, staying present, watching her opponents the way a chess player watches a board. Vanessa had circled her, talking about respect and hierarchy and lessons that needed to be learned, and Jordan had tracked her movement while monitoring everyone else's positions. Blake was to her right, Ryan to her left, Tiffany near the door, Vanessa in front. All predictable positions, all manageable. Vanessa had made her move suddenly, stepping forward and reaching for Jordan's shirt, presumably to push or grab or do something physical that would establish dominance. But Jordan had moved first, redirecting Vanessa's hands and stepping aside so smoothly that Vanessa stumbled forward into empty space. The movement had been so fast and efficient that for a moment everyone had just stared, trying to process what had happened. Jordan had reset her position, centered again, and waited. Blake had moved next, annoyed, trying to grab Jordan's arm and pull her off balance. Jordan had used his momentum against him, twisting in a way that made Blake twist with her, and suddenly Blake was on the ground looking confused, while Jordan stood over him, calm and controlled. Ryan had been smarter, recognizing that Jordan knew what she was doing and approaching more carefully. He'd tried to talk while moving, distracting her with words while positioning himself for a grab. But Jordan had seen the strategy and countered by staying mobile, never letting him get close enough to execute. Tiffany had moved toward the door, presumably to get help, but Emma had appeared there first, having escaped Madison's grip somehow and blocked Tiffany's exit. The situation had shifted entirely. Jordan was no longer the victim, but the center of calm in a room full of people who'd suddenly realized they'd made a serious miscalculation. Vanessa had been the last to understand. She'd ordered Blake and Ryan to grab Jordan, to hold her while Vanessa did whatever she'd planned. But neither boy had moved with any enthusiasm. Jordan had made it clear, without saying a word, that anyone who touched her would regret it. And both Blake and Ryan had enough self-preservation instinct to recognize superior skill when confronted with it. Vanessa had looked around, seeing her power structure crumbling, and made one final attempt to reassert control by stepping toward Jordan herself, hand raised as if to strike. Jordan had caught Vanessa's wrist mid-movement, holding it gently but immovably, and looked directly into Vanessa's eyes with an expression that communicated everything that had been building for months. "I am not your victim, I never was, and this ends now." The confrontation had ended there, without violence beyond what was necessary to establish boundaries. Jordan had released Vanessa's wrist and stepped back, putting distance between them, and told everyone clearly that she was done being their entertainment. She'd explained that she'd spent months enduring their harassment because she'd believed it was the right thing to do, because she'd been taught that violence was a last resort, but that tolerance had limits and they'd exceeded them. She'd told them about her training, about her father, about the skills she'd chosen not to use but could access whenever she needed to. The revelation had been devastating to Vanessa's group. The person they'd seen as weak and helpless was neither, and the power dynamic they'd relied on was built on a false foundation. Jordan and Emma had left the art studio without looking back, walking across the dark campus toward the parking lot where Emma's car was parked. Behind them, Vanessa's group remained in the studio, presumably processing what had just happened and deciding how to respond. Jordan's hands were shaking from adrenaline, and Emma was talking rapidly about how amazing that had been, how perfect, how Vanessa's face had looked when she realized Jordan could fight. But Jordan felt no triumph, just exhaustion and relief that it was over, that the confrontation she'd been dreading and preparing for had finally happened, and she'd handled it without losing control, without becoming the kind of person who used power to hurt rather than protect. But the story doesn't end with that confrontation in the art studio, because real transformation takes time, and the consequences of actions ripple outward in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. The Monday after the Valentine's Day dance, Jordan had arrived at school expecting retaliation, prepared for escalation, and found instead a strange silence. Vanessa wasn't in first period. Blake and Ryan avoided eye contact in the hallway. Tiffany was absent entirely. The normal rhythm of the school day was disrupted by the absence of people who usually dominated the social landscape, and Jordan had moved through her classes in a state of heightened awareness, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped during lunch, when Jordan and Emma were sitting in the cafeteria at their usual table. Principal Hayward had approached, a woman in her 50s with grey hair and an expression of professional concern, and asked Jordan to come to her office. Emma had started to rise as well, but Principal Hayward had gestured for her to stay. This was just about Jordan, and Jordan had followed the principal through the cafeteria while dozens of eyes tracked her movement. The walk to the administration building felt like a death march, and Jordan had prepared herself mentally for accusations, for punishment, for whatever consequences had emerged from Saturday night's confrontation. But Principal Hayward hadn't been angry. She'd been confused and curious, trying to understand what had happened from multiple contradictory accounts. Vanessa had come forward, along with her parents and their lawyer, claiming that Jordan had attacked her without provocation at the dance. But Emma had also come forward, along with 3 students from the basketball team who'd seen parts of what happened, and their story was very different. Mr. Giordano had provided security footage from the art studio that showed the sequence of events clearly, though without audio, it was open to interpretation. Principal Hayward had asked Jordan for her version, and Jordan had told the truth completely, including the months of harassment that had preceded Saturday night, the escalation, the confrontation, and her choice to use only the minimal force necessary to establish boundaries and leave safely. Principal Hayward had listened, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, and when Jordan finished, she'd been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd asked why Jordan hadn't come forward sooner, why she'd endured months of harassment without reporting it, and Jordan had explained about her previous attempt to get help, about Ms. Henderson's response, about the difficulty of proving harassment that was designed to be deniable. Principal Hayward had nodded, her expression suggesting she understood the systemic failures that had allowed the situation to escalate to this point, and she'd told Jordan that she wasn't in trouble, but that there would be an investigation, that Jordan should expect to be interviewed by the school resource officer, and that in the meantime, Jordan should continue her normal routine and report any further harassment immediately. The investigation took 2 weeks, during which time Vanessa and her entire group were suspended pending the outcome. The absence of their presence changed Ridgemont Valley High's atmosphere dramatically. Students who'd been quiet before started talking about their own experiences with Vanessa's group, sharing stories of harassment and intimidation that painted a picture of systematic bullying that had gone on for years. Jordan became something of a folk hero, the quiet girl who'd stood up to the most powerful clique in school and won, though Jordan herself was uncomfortable with the attention and the mythologizing of what had happened. She hadn't wanted to be a hero, just to be left alone, but the narrative that emerged was beyond her control. When the investigation concluded, Principal Hayward had called a school assembly to announce the results and new policies. Vanessa, Blake, Ryan, Tiffany, and Madison were all being transferred to different schools in the district, a decision made in consultation with their parents and based on the extensive evidence of harassment that had been uncovered. Principal Hayward had apologized to the student body for the administration's failure to recognize and address the bullying sooner, and she'd announced new reporting procedures, new training for staff, and new consequences for harassment of any kind. The assembly had been uncomfortable for everyone involved, a public acknowledgement of failures and a promise to do better, and Jordan had sat in the bleachers feeling vindicated and exhausted in equal measure. The weeks that followed were strange. Jordan's status at Ridgemont Valley High transformed overnight from invisible outsider to respected figure, though the respect was tinged with wariness, as if people weren't quite sure how to approach someone who'd revealed unexpected capabilities. Emma remained her closest friend, and through Emma, Jordan developed connections with the basketball team and other students who existed outside the traditional popularity hierarchy. David continued to spend time with Jordan in the art studio, now openly rather than discreetly, and their friendship deepened into something Jordan valued highly. She even started tutoring other students in physics, having been approached by Ms. Reeves, who recognized Jordan's aptitude and thought she might be able to help struggling classmates. But the most significant change was internal. Jordan no longer walked through the hallways with her shoulders curved inward, no longer made herself invisible, no longer carried the weight of constant vigilance. She'd learned that strength wasn't just about physical capability, but about boundaries and self-respect, about knowing when to endure and when to resist, about using power responsibly. Her training with Daniel continued, but the focus shifted from preparation for conflict to maintenance of capability, and they spent more time talking about philosophy than practicing techniques. Daniel was proud of her, not because she'd fought, but because she'd shown restraint, because she'd used the minimum necessary force, because she'd understood that the goal was never to destroy an opponent, but to establish that she was not a victim. The Valentine's Day dance incident became legendary at Ridgemont Valley High, the story growing and changing with each retelling until it bore little resemblance to what actually happened. Some versions had Jordan fighting off a dozen attackers. Others claimed she'd sent Blake to the hospital. A few suggested she was secretly training to be a professional fighter or had special forces background herself. Jordan corrected these stories when she heard them, trying to keep the truth from being buried under layers of myth. But she understood that the real story was less exciting than the legend, and people preferred excitement over accuracy. In March, something unexpected happened. Vanessa reached out to Jordan through David, asking if they could meet and talk. Jordan's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the boundaries she'd established, and let Vanessa deal with the consequences of her actions without any input from Jordan. But Emma had encouraged her to meet, suggesting that closure might be valuable for both of them, and Daniel had agreed, noting that understanding former enemies was part of moving forward. Jordan had finally agreed to meet in a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Ridgemont, away from school territory, with Emma waiting in the car outside. Vanessa had looked different than Jordan remembered, smaller somehow, less polished, without the armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup. She'd been at her new school for a month and was clearly struggling with the adjustment, going from queen of the social hierarchy to anonymous new student. She'd apologized to Jordan, a genuine apology rather than the performative kind that had characterized so many of their previous interactions, and explained that she'd been carrying her own pressures and insecurities and had taken them out on Jordan because Jordan had seemed like a safe target. The explanation wasn't an excuse, and Vanessa made that clear. She took full responsibility for her choices and their consequences, but it provided context that helped Jordan understand the machinery that had driven Vanessa's behavior. Jordan had listened, had thanked Vanessa for the apology, and had told her about her own experience, about feeling trapped and invisible, about the choice to endure rather than escalate, about the training that had given her options she'd been reluctant to use. They'd talked for over an hour, two people who'd been locked in a destructive dynamic, trying to understand how they'd ended up there and what they could learn from it. The conversation didn't make them friends, but it provided closure that neither had expected to find. And when they'd parted ways, Jordan felt lighter than she had in months. The rest of Jordan's time at Ridgemont Valley High passed without major incident. She continued her classes, her training, her time in the art studio. She and Emma grew closer, their friendship deepening into something that might eventually become more, though neither was in a rush to define it. David became like a brother, someone Jordan trusted completely and whose presence made the school feel less hostile. Mr. Giordano became something of a mentor, recognizing Jordan's artistic talent and encouraging her to think about pursuing it seriously after graduation. Even Ms. Reeves took an interest, seeing in Jordan someone who understood physics not just as equations, but as descriptions of the fundamental patterns that governed reality. By the time summer arrived, Jordan had been at Ridgemont Valley High for less than a year, but it felt like a lifetime. She'd arrived invisible and afraid, endured months of harassment, found strength she hadn't known she possessed, and emerged transformed in ways that went beyond any simple narrative of victim turned victor. She'd learned that true strength was about boundaries and self-respect, that violence was a tool to be used sparingly and with care, that understanding enemies didn't excuse their behavior, but made forgiveness possible, and that transformation was a process rather than an event. On the last day of school, Jordan had walked across campus one final time before summer break, taking in the familiar spaces that had been the setting for so much change. The quad, where she'd felt so exposed and vulnerable now, seemed smaller, less intimidating. The cafeteria, where she'd been humiliated, was just a room full of tables and noise. The gym, where she'd dreaded physical education, was just a building. The art studio remained her sanctuary, but she no longer needed sanctuary because she'd built it inside herself instead of seeking it in external spaces. Jordan had realized, standing there in the June sunlight, with students streaming past her towards summer freedom, that the real victory hadn't been the confrontation in the art studio or the changes that followed. The real victory was internal, the reconstruction of her sense of self, the understanding that she was strong not because she could fight, but because she knew when to fight and when to walk away. Daniel had picked her up that afternoon, and during the drive home, he'd asked how she was feeling. Jordan had told him about the strange sense of closure, about feeling ready to move forward, about gratitude for the training, but also hope that she'd never need to use it again in the same way. Daniel had nodded, understanding in the way that people who've experienced their own transformations understand others going through them, and told her that strength was like any other skill. You maintained it not because you planned to use it, but because knowing you could use it changed how you moved through the world. Jordan had realized he was right. that the confidence she now carried wasn't about her ability to fight, but about her unwillingness to be victimized, that the real lesson of the past months wasn't about technique or strategy, but about self-respect and boundaries. As summer stretched ahead, full of possibilities and free of the daily stress of navigating Ridgemont Valley High's social landscape, Jordan found herself reflecting on the journey she'd taken. She'd arrived at the school as someone running from her past, trying to be invisible, absorbing punishment because she believed endurance was noble. She'd endured months of harassment that had tested her patience and challenged her sense of self. She'd discovered friendship with Emma and David, people who saw her as she was, rather than as she appeared, and those relationships had given her strength beyond what any training could provide. She'd confronted Vanessa and her group not with rage, but with clarity, establishing boundaries that were overdue and doing so with the minimum necessary force. And in the aftermath, she'd found a new equilibrium, a way of being in the world that was neither invisible nor aggressive, that acknowledged strength while choosing compassion, that recognized the humanity in everyone, including those who'd tried to diminish hers. The story of Jordan Hayes could have ended with the confrontation, with the dramatic moment of reversal when the victim revealed herself to be more than anyone had expected. But real stories don't end with single moments. They continue through all the small choices and adjustments that follow transformation. Jordan's story continued through the summer and the years that followed, through the rest of her time at Ridgemont Valley High and beyond, through the ongoing process of becoming the person she was meant to be. The bullying had been a catalyst, painful but ultimately transformative, forcing Jordan to confront questions about strength and identity and justice that she might have avoided otherwise. The training with her father had given her tools, but the real work had been internal, the slow building of self-respect and boundary setting that no amount of physical technique could replace. Looking back later, Jordan would recognize that period as pivotal, the moment when she stopped being shaped by others' perceptions and started shaping her own identity. She'd learned that true strength was not about domination, but about balance, not about winning, but about maintaining integrity, not about revenge, but about justice. She'd learned that understanding enemies made them human without excusing their behavior, that forgiveness was possible even when reconciliation wasn't, that transformation was available to everyone willing to do the work. Most importantly, she'd learned that the quiet, underestimated person she'd appeared to be was just one aspect of a much more complex identity, that weakness and strength coexisted in everyone, and that choosing when to reveal strength was as important as possessing it. The incident that became legendary at Ridgemont Valley High, the quiet girl who stood up to the bullies and changed everything, was really just a moment in a longer story of growth and self-discovery. Jordan hadn't set out to be a hero or to create change beyond her own situation. She'd simply reached a point where endurance was no longer possible without losing herself, and she'd made a choice to establish boundaries that should have been respected from the beginning. That choice had consequences that rippled beyond what she'd intended, creating space for other students to come forward, forcing the administration to acknowledge systematic failures, and beginning a conversation about bullying and power that the school had avoided for too long. But for Jordan personally, the real victory was simpler and more profound than any external change. She'd reclaimed her sense of self, transformed from someone who absorbed abuse to someone who established clear boundaries, and learned that strength and compassion weren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a balanced life. She'd discovered that the skills her father had taught her were valuable not because they made her dangerous, but because they made her confident, not because they enabled violence, but because they enabled choice. And she'd learned that transformation was possible, that the person you are at one moment isn't fixed, that growth sometimes requires confrontation, and that becoming who you're meant to be sometimes means showing people who you really are, rather than who they think you are. The story that began with humiliation and fear ended with confidence and clarity, not because Jordan had won a fight, but because she'd won something more important: respect for herself, understanding of others, and knowledge that she could handle whatever challenges came next. The bullies who'd made her life miserable for months had inadvertently given her a gift, forcing her to recognize and develop strength she'd been hiding from herself as much as from others. And in the end, Jordan was grateful not for the bullying itself, but for what she'd learned from it, for the person she'd become in response to it, for the understanding that adversity could be transformative if you chose to grow rather than to diminish. Years later, when Jordan thought about her time at Ridgemont Valley High, she wouldn't remember the specific insults or humiliations that had seemed so devastating at the time. She'd remember instead the moment she decided to change, the training sessions with her father that rebuilt her confidence, the friendships with Emma and David that showed her what real connection looked like, and the confrontation that proved to herself that she was stronger than her fears. She'd remember that transformation wasn't a single event, but a process. That strength required constant practice and renewal, that boundaries needed to be maintained even after they were established, and that the person she'd become was built on the foundation of the person she'd been, incorporating all the experiences, painful and joyful, that had shaped her journey. The lesson Jordan carried forward from those months at Ridgemont Valley High was simple but profound. You teach people how to treat you, and if you don't respect yourself, no one else will either. She'd spent months teaching people through her silence that she was willing to accept abuse, and it had taken a dramatic reversal to teach them something different. But the real teaching had been internal, Jordan teaching herself that she had value, that her boundaries mattered, that strength was about self-respect rather than aggression, and that she had every right to take up space in the world rather than making herself invisible to avoid conflict. Those lessons stayed with her long after the specific details of the bullying faded, informing her choices and shaping her identity in ways that extended far beyond that 1 year at that one school. And so, Jordan Hayes, who'd arrived at Ridgemont Valley High as a quiet, invisible outsider, and become the center of a story about transformation and justice, moved forward into her future, carrying the knowledge that strength and compassion could coexist, that boundaries were essential to self-respect, that understanding enemies made forgiveness possible, and that the person you appear to be isn't always the person you are. She'd been underestimated and dismissed, harassed and humiliated, but she'd emerged from that experience not broken, but transformed, not bitter but balanced, not angry but aware. The bullies had thrown her bra in the hallway, and she'd responded by showing them and herself who she really was, establishing boundaries that should have been respected from the beginning, and proving that quiet strength is often the most powerful kind. The story ended not with revenge, but with redemption, not with violence, but with justice, not with hatred, but with understanding, exactly as it should. Jordan had learned that the hero's journey wasn't about defeating enemies, but about discovering yourself, that the real battle was internal rather than external, and that transformation required courage, but also compassion, strength, but also restraint. She'd walked through fire and emerged tempered rather than burned, changed but not destroyed, and in doing so she'd shown everyone, including herself, that the quiet, underestimated person is sometimes the strongest one in the room.